today's World Insight with Tianwei, South Korea downgrades Japan's trade status, a response to a similar action from Tokyo. What would pull them back from the brink? And immigrants who benefited from government aid less likely to remain in the U.S. An about-face in U.S. immigration policy? Here is our host, Tianwei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tianwei, the program coming to you live on CGTN from Beijing. The trade dispute between Japan and South Korea takes a turn for the worse. Seoul has stripped Japan of its favored trade status weeks after Japan's cabinet approved South Korea's removal from a preferential trade list. Seoul accuses Tokyo of using trade to retaliate over court decisions seeking compensation from Japanese companies for forced labor during World War II. Is there more that meets the eyes in the trade spat between the East Asian neighbors? Take a look.
A trade route tangled with wartime history led to chillier ties between South Korea and Japan. On Wednesday, more than 1,000 people gathered outside the Japanese embassy in Seoul to protest Japan's economic retaliations and urge Tokyo to face up to World War II sexual slavery victims. The day before, hundreds of South Korean protesters held a rally in central Seoul against Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe over simmering trade tensions.
I think the exclusion of South Korea from Japan's whitelist is a trade retaliation against the ruling on compensation for forced labor cases. We condemn the Abe government for their measures, but we would like to remain friendly with Japan's mature and conscientious citizens.
The new round of diplomatic standoff started after the South Korean Supreme Court ruled that several Japanese companies had to compensate victims of wartime forced labor. Tokyo responded that the restitution had already been paid through an agreement made in 1965. Amid this dispute, on July the 1st, Japan restricted the export of all key chemical inputs used to make semiconductors, flat screens and other high-tech products to South Korea. Tokyo cited national security grounds behind their decision because they can also be used in military hardware. Earlier this week, Seoul announced it would drop Japan from a list of preferential partners that allows for fast-track trade status. Both countries have expressed little concern over each other's actions, saying their countries will not be severely affected. South Korea and Japan are competing heavily in the international semiconductor market. Some analysts believe Japan wants to paralyze the industry in South Korea and kick its long-time competitor out of the game. If it is indeed Japan's plan, it could backfire, with South Korea turning to other trade partners and strain a common alliance with the U.S.
So how will the Japan-South Korea trade dispute likely play out? Let's ask our panelists. In Boston, we have Myung-Koo Kang, who is an associate professor of the Department of Political Science from the City University of New York. In Seoul, we invited Katsuhisa Furukawa, a Japanese expert on national security affairs and a former expert of the UN DPRK panel. In Beijing, last but not least, Liu Baocheng, Dean of the Center for International Business Ethics from University of International Business and Economics. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. First, go to you, Professor Kang. Now, South Korea has announced that Japan being categorized into one of the three trade nation categories, and Japan was the only one on one category, so-called Category 2. So what does that mean for the mid and the long-term trade relations between South Korea and Japan?
I think it's a symbolic measure from the South Korean government. So South Korean government cannot accept retaliatory measure adopted by the Japanese government. So it's a kind of a tit-for-tat measure. But of course, South Korean government's official nominal excuse is that the Japanese government has not managed so-called strategic materials properly. So that's the nominal excuse. But underlying message is that South Korean government wants to quite serious about the retaliatory measure adopted by the Japanese government, and the ongoing trade war can last much longer than most people expect.
I see. Mr. Furukawa, now the Japanese government issued the travel warning to the Japanese citizens going to South Korea, particularly during this week. As we know, South Korea this week is commemorating those who have lost their lives during the Second World War and during the Japanese occupation of South Korea, and honor those of their families. So, Mr. Furukawa, many wonder, though, from the Japanese government's measure, is this another level making the two countries drifting further apart, hurting even the people-to-people exchanges now?
Well, I'm a Japanese national, but I'm traveling safely. I'm based in Seoul right now, and I see no significant obstacle for my travel. Currently, there is a strong emotions among the South Korean politicians and also South Korean people about the implication of the measures undertaken by Japanese government. Export control system is a complicated issue, and I don't think that it is correctly understood by a majority of the South Korean people, not to mention South Korean government. I hope that this misunderstanding will fade away in the next 1 or 2 months.
Okay, Mr. Furukawa, since you talk about misunderstanding, then what is the best way to understand it from your perspective?
The export control issues that we are talking about right now have nothing to do with the fast-track trade status at all. Like many other countries, Japan has export control system. When certain goods and technologies are exported from Japan, Japanese government issue permit to the Japanese exporter. After confirming that those cargoes or technologies to be exported from Japan will not be diverted for military use abroad unintentionally. Over the past few years, regrettably, there are certain incidents involving specific South Korean companies where Japanese government could not be confident about the whereabouts of the eventual destination of specific chemicals that can be also converted for use by the for use for the chemical weapons or certain conventional weapon systems. Therefore, although Japan grants expeditious permission processing for specific countries, which used to involve South Korea, but now South Korea is off the list. But this means that South Korea currently enjoys the same status like the one of China. We have no trade restriction issues with China. So this is a major misunderstanding, in my view.
You used to have a certain special status. Now that status is being taken away. Of course, there's something is happening over there, to say the least. Professor Kang, that is in simple logic. But to you, what does it say about the strategic, if there is any, from your perspective, approach that Japan is making toward South Korea, trade-wise? Is it a clear signal?
I think the commentators, official claim, repeating the Japanese government, claim that eliminating South Korea from the export, expediting, preferential trade treatment. I think that kind of explanation is wrong, and it's not accepted like that in the Korean context. I mean, Japanese, this preferential trade treatment, including 27 countries in total. But out of those 27 countries, South Korea was the only Asian country. But Japanese government eliminated South Korea from the list. So it has a very important, critical message to the South Korean government and the people. Another important thing is that all those, 3 major chemicals, restricted the Japanese government. Those 3 chemicals are so critical for the semiconductor industry in South Korea, and then producing, flat panels and all sorts kind of thing. And then Samsung Electronics and SK Hynix and LG and all those major Korean big companies are heavily relying on imports from Japan. So if the Japanese government restricts, those key chemicals and materials, I mean, it has a really cutthroat, life-threatening effect on the Korean semiconductor industry and overall economy in South Korea. I think that is a very, very important point. Another thing is that many Japanese politicians, including Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, made it quite clear Japanese measure was a dissatisfaction about the South Korean Supreme Court decision about the enforced labor during the wartime period. And also the Japanese government repeatedly expressed its dissatisfaction against the South Korean government measure regarding the comfort woman issue.
Yeah.
And I think so the Japanese government move in dealing with South Korea right now, it's a kind of really not just economic measure, it's quite closely related. As we repeatedly pointed out, it's quite closely related how to interpret the Japanese war crimes, how to interpret Japanese colonial rule, and it's quite closely related to the national pride and identity of both countries. So I think we need to take into account this issue far more broader historical context.
Okay, now both sides have explained already quite clearly where this stands, and also what are the reasons as to why they're saying what they're saying right now. Professor Liu, here is the issue. Whether it is history or whether it is political differences. Now we see one case study specific that it falls eventually into trade relations. And we do not know how long this would likely to last. Now, what does this case study say to us about how vulnerable these days, as a result of unilateral approach we've seen over the past few years in different parts of the world, for trade?
Well, it indicates that bad examples is very contagious. So, being the close allies of the United States for Korea and Japan, and they all mimic the example of Donald Trump, to politicize the trade issues and even weaponize the trade disputes. And it also indicative of a potential danger that when a dispute settlement mechanism on fairness and justice is being in jeopardy, and each country can really take unilateral measures to stab the other country they are not happy with, and this may really run out of control. And so many other countries facing similar issues would try to replicate such sort of practice and send the world economic order and trade order into a chaos.
Mr. Furukawa, do you think whether it's Japan or other countries will be in the future using these kinds of dissatisfaction issues as a way or as a reason for technological decoupling in a way?
First of all, I should point out that the bilateral relation between South Korea and Japan has deteriorated, which the principal reasons for this include, as the other professor correctly mentioned, the history issues was one of the causes. But for specific this export control related issues, let me re-emphasize once again that this is not trade restriction, because the 26 countries, for the other 26 countries, Japan has a very good relationship.
Yeah. But Professor,
starting cargo or
Mr. Furukawa, I know you
Japan.
what you want to say. You will repeat the same stance as you said earlier, which we all well understand with your clear explanation. But my question really is, well knowing, I'm sure the Japanese government is very smart, and well knowing that the three chemicals are crucial for the semiconductor industry in South Korea. I'm talking about the result of this policy rather than what you claim as the intention of the policy. So the result is, will there be further technological decoupling between these two countries? Now, I'm saying this not for criticism of any of the two countries, because it's up to the two countries to decide what you want. But this is an interesting case study for the rest of the world, and that's why we want to talk about it right here on such a platform for discussion. Mr. Furukawa, do you worry about that fact?
I'm not worried about because there is, first of all, there is no factual basis that the export was prohibited. The export of 3 products to South Korea from Japan was prohibited. There is no such factual basis. And we have been trading with China and all the other Asian countries without any problem. South Korea is currently placed in the same category. And it means that it's not restricting the trade, but it means that Japanese government will confirm for each contract or export contract that the goods or technologies will not be used or re-exported from South Korea to some other third countries.
All right.
So, yeah, the issue will fade away.
It seems that you're repeating your earlier description. I understand that. Then, Professor Kang, also, if you have anything fresh to offer?
Oh, yeah. I mean, you asked the question whether it's a history issue, whether it's an economic issue, political issue, also it's kind of very critical question. Let me highlight one important aspect going on in Japan. We know that Japanese economy has suffered from the burst of the bubble economy since the early 1990s. But we have not paid attention to the political consequences of long deflation going on in Japan. That consequence is the rise of ultranationalism. For example, one of such examples is the growing influence of Nippon Kaigi. Yeah, literally means Japan Conference. The membership is 38,000 people. Right now, Prime Minister Shinzo Abe is honorary chairman or the special advisor to the committee. And more than half of Japanese Diet politicians are the member of the Nippon Kaigi. And the Nippon Kaigi's real message is quite important.
Okay.
They try to revise the history. So they want to revise basically the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal interpretation of history and restoring the World War II Imperial Japan's the past glory.
Okay.
So in that context, for instance, most of Chinese people are fully aware of the 1937 Nanking massacre, but the Nippon Kaigi, basically, it's a fabricated thing, and that they deny it. Likewise, they deny any wrongdoings happened during the Pacific War and the Japanese colonial rule.
Okay,
so the
Professor,
ongoing, this rise of ultranationalism is we need to pay attention to that aspect as well.
Okay, Professor, if I could just be fair, also suggest that people would ask back as well as to how much proportion are there in the South Korean political circle that is made up of business people and influential business people from the South Korean context. I'm just putting that question up there just for fairness. Professor Liu, let me come back to you as well. It seems that it's not just the trade and history, but it's also what's going on in this part of the world. Now, we all understand there are a lot of nuances at this point. Now, there is Japan that is gaining more momentum and certainly pride as a result of being successfully an instrumental player in the CPTPP, for example, after the United States tried to stay away from a multilateral system. Also, Japan building 2020 Olympic Games. That certainly is a great moment for Japan as well. And meanwhile, successfully hosting the G20 summit. All of these seems to be very good momentum for Japan. Now, Japan has chosen the surplus time to do what it is doing now with South Korea. What does it say also about, from your perspective, the overall analysis Japan might have about the region?
Well, Japan...
And then later, of course, I'm going to our Japanese counterpart for that. Professor Liu, you want to go first?
Well, Japan, eternally, they really wanted to revive their economy after the last 2 decades. And regionally, Japan has always got the intention to assume the more respectable leadership in economic cooperation. And also that Japan will have to implement the will, evil or good from the United States, as an instrument in Asia.
I see.
So, and also Japan is in a rivalry position economically and industrial sector-wise with South Korea, and that really explains the fundamentals of a adversary type of attitude, aside from political or diplomatic consideration.
That is your analysis. Mr. Furukawa, of course, I want to go to you. You need to have a say over here about this thing because of the DPRK nuclear issue, because of the Japan, South Korea, and the United States trilateral status and evolving relationship, because of the rise of China, because of Japan trying to seek more known in the world and in the region. What does it say to all of the background and backdrop of Japan's decision in this case?
Well, I don't know what to say, but let me state that South Korea is a very important country for Japan, and Japan's export control issue is not intended to destroy South Korean economy at all. Once again, there is no restriction or prohibition of the exports from Japan to South Korea. But I'm more concerned about the slowing down of the Chinese economy, which is significantly impacting the South Korean economy. Second quarter of the South Korean economic growth significantly deteriorated this year because of the slowing down of the Chinese economy due to the U.S.-China trade conflict. This is prior to the institution of the new Japan's export control measures. Therefore, we should be concerned more about this global trade dispute between two major countries. And Japanese, we are experts, so we need to have a more evidence-based discussions. And yeah, that's a point I want to just emphasize. I can't explain in 1 or 2 minutes for everything. Sorry.
All right. Let me go to you also for the final words, Mr. Kang, Professor.
Right. As we know well, economic globalization or economic interdependence, growing economic interdependence, it needs more multilateral coordination mechanism, which is called, multilateral governance system. So ongoing intra-regional trade volume in Asia has been on the rise. China's trade relationship with South Korea and Japan and other ASEAN countries, entire Asia has been on the rise. So we need multilateral coordination mechanism to deal with growing economic interdependence. So the Japanese unilateral, this kind of measure disrupts the ongoing efforts to build multilateral governance or coordination mechanism in Asia. So whatever the consequences we can get from this ongoing conflict between South Korea and Japan, I think the Japanese government will lose its credibility and leadership in building this such kind of multilateral governance system in Asia.
Thank you very much for the three of you, Professor Kang, Mr. Furukawa, and Professor Liu. Really appreciate it. And you're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei, coming to you live from CGTN. Further on our program, immigrants who benefited from government aid less likely to remain in the U.S. and about faith in the U.S. immigration policy, that's up for discussion right after this break. Welcome back. You're still watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The Trump administration is moving forward with regulations denying green cards and visas to immigrants if they receive any type of government aid. Critics believe the new policy could hurt millions of immigrants already living in the U.S. Before we turn to our panelists for further discussion about this, take a look at the backgrounder.
Give me your tired and your poor who can stand on their own 2 feet and who will not become a public charge, said Ken Cuccinelli, the acting director of U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, on Tuesday. Twisting Emma Lazarus's famous words on the Statue of Liberty, he unveiled a new rule on Monday that could deny visas and permanent residency to hundreds of thousands of people who relied on government aid, a new move to significantly curb legal immigration.
Through the public charge rule, President Trump's administration is reinforcing the ideals of self-sufficiency and personal responsibility, ensuring that immigrants are able to support themselves and become successful here in America.
This comes less than a week after Immigration and Customs Enforcement cracked down on Mississippi poultry plants, taking into custody 680 undocumented workers, leaving their children stranded and alone.
Government, please put your heart. Let my parents be free with everybody else, please.
The new immigration policy, which will take effect October 15, makes it harder for low-income legal immigrants who receive food stamps or other forms of taxpayer-funded assistance to stay in the country legally. Since he first announced his candidacy for president in 2015, Mr. Trump has tried to build an insurmountable wall for legal and illegal immigrants, with a clear focus on poor people and people of color. In 2017, the administration has backed proposals for the RAISE Act, seeking to cut levels of legal immigration by 50% by halving the number of green cards issued. Visas will be approved based on a merit system.
I campaigned on creating a merit-based immigration system that protects U.S. workers and taxpayers, and that is why we are here today, merit-based.
In April 2018, Attorney General Jeff Sessions announced a zero-tolerance policy in dealing with migrants who cross into the U.S. illegally. A public outcry over the separation of families followed.
If you don't want your child to be separated, then don't bring them across the border illegally. It's not our fault that somebody does that.
AP reported over 380,000 out of 540,000 applicants every year will have to face the new evaluations. Wealth, education, age, and English language skills will take on greater importance in the process of obtaining a U.S. green card.
On the new U.S. immigration policy, we're joined in Washington, D.C. by Alan Orr Jr., founder of the Orr Immigration Law Firm, PC, who's also the second vice president of the American Immigration Lawyers Association. Also in D.C., we have Jason Malika, who is a professorial lecturer at the School of Communication from the American University. Joining us in Beijing, Victor Gaujikai, chairman of the CESI, vice president of CCG. Welcome to the three of you. I want to go to you first, Mr. Orr. What does the new rule say about the nature of U.S. immigration policies for the future?
It is just an expansion of the existing invisible wall that this administration is putting up against brown and black and poor immigrants. And so basically it has changed the rules that have existed since 1882 and to make it something more of a harsh punishment and a way for an officer to have discretion to eliminate individuals, not just based on fact, but also based on what they think might happen to that immigrant in the future.
Mr. Malika, do you agree with that?
I absolutely agree with Mr. Orr. The problem we're having in this country now is that we appear, by what the president says and then by what the media unfortunately has to report, is we do not appear welcoming at all as a country. If you come here, you're going to be basically sent back. If you don't make enough money, we're going to restrict you from getting aid. It definitely does not echo what Emma Lazarus's poem on the Statue of Liberty says in this, as it is said on the side of the Statue of Liberty for decades.
It's very interesting to talk about the Statue of Liberty. Now, earlier there were some members of the administration, Mr. Orr, that were suggesting the poem, suggesting about the courage of immigrants to America. Mainly it's describing those coming from Europe. What do you say? What do you have to say about that? Particularly, obviously, you are an African-American immigrant.
Absolutely. It just proves that Ken Cuccinelli is not the person for this job, and he doesn't have a clear understanding of the basis of the United States. It has never stood for that. There was a time back before, like I said, that there was much exclusion for even Chinese nationals based on these sort of national preferences, but America has long moved away from that in the changes in '65. So we need to start to understand and appreciate who we are, and there's this sort of new birth of proving others, and that's really what the point is, to show others and takers, because this is a problem that is addressing only 6% of all immigrants in the United States. So it's really not an issue to be addressed.
If you look at the immigrants going to the United States and how they have been shaping America, at least those of us who are watching this from outside the country, you see quite a number of names synonymous with genius. Albert Einstein, for example, is a wartime immigrant who credited as the father of modern physics. Many immigrants also made it big in the digital world, including Google CEO and also YouTube founders. In the U.S. politics, the first female U.S. Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, a Czech immigrant, while a former California Governor, Arnold Schwarzenegger, also known as Terminator films, was also from Austria. And the list goes on. Of course, the early generations of Chinese Americans, the Chinese immigrants go to America, try to build the railroad for the United States, which paved the way for modern U.S. Now, having said that, though, Mr. Gao, let me ask you about this. Coming from outside the United States, looking at what's going on in that country, what does it say to you?
I think up to now, the United States is well known in the world as a country welcoming immigrants of all kinds, of all colors, from all parts of the world. But this new policy, I'm afraid, is very much of a discriminatory in nature, because it's designed to keep certain people out and to open the door wider for certain other people. Eventually, I think it's very much based on color, on economic conditions of the potential immigrants, and this will really change the whole nature of the immigration policy of the United States. And the door open for immigrants will only be a door open for certain kinds of immigrants, but closed for many other kinds of immigrants. So probably it will not work in the long term. It will be very counterproductive.
Mr. Malika, if you look at the United States today, obviously it's going through quite an economic transformation, and therefore with great economy and job growth, many would wonder the United States would need more laborers, particularly experienced laborers, educated laborers, to a certain extent, for your economy. Now, in the short term, you wouldn't see anything as a result of the immigration policy, of course, but in the mid and long term, if things like this continue, what would be the impact for your economy in a way?
Well, if you think about it, many of the people that this immigration idea would affect are people that are working, in a sense, minimum wage jobs. Sure, the minimum wage has been rising in certain states to $13, $14 an hour, but that's still not enough to live in this country. So the people that are relying on these programs, food stamps, et cetera, to get food, to be able to have a place to live, this is going to affect our economy, because those jobs will not be taken up by people that in many ways in the United States didn't want that particular job. Think about home builders. We think about people that are working in fields and are picking vegetables and fruit. They aren't every day, with all due respect, it's not a middle-class white person picking these fruits and vegetables. It's often a migrant worker. And I mean no offense by that. I just mean by the fact, if you look in many of the places where migrants are working, they're working in the fields. And those are the people that will be affected. We will see the economy get affected in this way, because those jobs will no longer be there. If they're no longer there, the money is no longer there, and we see the signs of recession and our economy taking a bigger dip than it may already have taken.
The other issue many people would ask, Mr. Orr, is about the fact why from one administration to another administration the immigration policy could change in such a dramatic term. Imagine some of these immigrants that we talk about today that are living on food stamps were actually coming earlier into the United States as immigrants, probably from the last administration's time, and now their fate totally changed. So the unpredictability of the American immigration policy, what would that make the United States as a destination of immigrants?
It makes it one of uncertainty because you can't really rely on the policies to continue. And I think it's an important point to know that most people who are on food stamps and that are taking this assistance, they're not taking the assistance for their entire life. They're taking it for a very short term of 6 months to a year to get back on their feet. And secondly, let's not forget that the First Lady is an immigrant that might not have qualified under this program because she came as a model from not a very wealthy country. So I think that's super important. And when we sort of talk about the needs of the United States, when there are raids in factories in Mississippi where 680 people are arrested, that is a clear sign that there are not visas available for the workforce that we need because companies aren't going out and looking for this labor for that reason.
Having said that, though, Mr. Gao, there are many Chinese immigrants going to the United States, even at this moment when Chinese economy is doing quite well, when the country is developing very fast, but people still want to have a different kinds of life. That's just a fact of life here. So will U.S. continue to be an attractive destination for Chinese immigrants, whether they're coming from China's mainland, Hong Kong, Taiwan, or Macau? Will it still be an attractive place?
Well, from the Chinese immigration perspective, the United States has always been one of the most, if not the most, attractive destinations for a variety of reasons. Higher education is another one, and good medical services, for example. Lots of reasons. And I think even though I personally do not like the recent change, the immigration policy, the United States is expected to remain one of the most important and attractive immigration destinations for the Chinese immigrants, including from mainland Hong Kong, Macau, Taiwan. And some people may have to pay more to get in. Some people may have to be more creative and brush up their academic or working experiences, for example. But given the sheer size of the Chinese population and the great eagerness of the Chinese people to go to live and work in the United States, I think there will be more and more Chinese interested in going to the United States.
Mr. Malika, from another perspective, if you look at what's going on with the immigration policy, of course it has a lot to do with the election season, which is coming up very soon. Actually, at this moment, there were already an enormous amount of political debates about that. What role will immigration policy play in the presidential election next year? What do you think? And how will that affect the fate of immigrants coming into this country?
Well, I think it's already a part of the conversation as the Democrats are campaigning for 2020. There are so many issues out there already. It's gun control, but immigration is a big part of that, and it will continue to be a big part of it because the president continues to make statements regarding that, or the administration continues to put out information and/or news that says we basically are trying to limit immigrants from coming into this country illegally, but limiting immigration in general. And then plenty of the Democratic candidates for president are both saying, look, we need a way to do this that is going to make our country still seem very welcoming. To go back to the last question you had for our other panelists, think of it from a marketing perspective or a communications perspective. You're not going to see marketing materials that say, don't come to the United States, but with all of the coverage that this is gaining, obviously worldwide, there are regular people that would probably say, if I even thought about immigrating the country, even if it is legally and going through the right channels, will I still feel like an outsider will I still feel like someone that isn't welcome even if I have the proper paperwork, even if I've gone through the proper channels? I think as an American, from my perspective, I would think, well, my country does not seem as welcoming as it once did. So while there are people that are still wanting to come to this country and will still immigrate here, there are a great many people, especially from the perspective of even those that are coming here to flee persecution or have a better life. They may think about it and they could risk their lives just to do that.
I see.
But from a perspective of the campaigns that are coming on for 2020 and as we move toward that big decision in November of 2020, the Democratic candidates are going to have to make sure that they are abundantly clear what they plan to do about the immigration issue in this country.
Well, if
and
they
to
are.
see how it will counteract what the president says.
Well, if they are. Mr. Orr, what about that? The political factor coming into the policy of immigrants and make it ever more vulnerable for those people. Briefly, we have 1 minute left, sir.
Yeah, I just feel like it's the president and administration is drawing us to the bad side of immigration, constantly talking about people invading the border or people who are undocumented, and not the positive side of immigration, all the benefits and that we reap from it, and the international perspective that we've sort of benefit from. So I just think it's missing the story. And as long as they draw us to this public charge rule and the border issue, we really miss the greater issue of what the benefits of immigration are.
Alan Orr, Jason Monica, and also Victor Jakai. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining me. Thank you. That's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight CGTN into your search engine. Check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching, and tune in again next time for more insights across China and around the world. Good night.